A dog slammed into the iron gate hard enough to rattle it off its hinges. Paws scraped down the bars. A low howl broke into a whine, then a bark that cracked halfway through. The animal spun, bit at a sleeve, and dragged the man toward the dark house. He stumbled. He caught the fence with one thick hand. Boots crunched gravel. The porch light was off. Every window in the place sat black, which was wrong, because the woman inside never let a night go dark. The dog pulled harder, tearing him past the door toward the barn out back. That was when Roy Calhoun stopped breathing. 62, gray beard down to his chest, and his hands were shaking. Something was wrong in that house, and his old bloodhound knew it before he did. What Diesel was dragging him toward would change everything. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up 2 days, because you need to understand the man standing at that gate. Roy Preacher Calhoun had led the Iron Disciples for 31 years. Not a gang. Get that out of your head right now. A club. A brotherhood of welders and veterans and men who'd made mistakes and come out the other side. They ran food to flooded counties. They stood guard at funerals when the whole world wanted to spit on grieving families. And every one of them called Roy Preacher. Not because he quoted scripture, but because when he talked, men went quiet and listened. He'd earned the name. He'd also earned the beard, the bad knee, and a reputation in Cedar Hollow, Tennessee, that ran exactly one direction: suspicion. To the good folks of that town, Roy was the leather. Roy was the noise. Roy was the reason mothers pulled their kids a little closer when the Harleys rolled through on a Sunday. 22 years he'd lived on that ridge, and 22 years the town had looked right past him. He'd made his peace with it, mostly. The one thing he was proud of more than the club, more than anything, was the war chest. That's what the disciples called it. An emergency fund. Cash, real cash, $41,000 of it, built one crumpled 20 at a time over 3 decades. Bake sales. Bike washes, poker runs. It sat locked in a steel box, and that box sat bolted inside a false wall in Roy's own back closet. If a brother's house burned, the war chest answered. If a brother's kid needed surgery, the war chest answered. It was sacred. Roy guarded it like a church guards its bell. And Ruth knew where it was. Ruth, his wife of 34 years. Now here's the thing about Ruth Calhoun. She was the quietest woman in 3 counties, small, soft-spoken. The kind of woman who'd apologize to a chair if she bumped into it. While Roy filled a doorway, Ruth seemed to fold herself smaller every year, like she was trying to take up less of the world. She baked. She kept the garden. She waved at neighbors who never waved back. On a Tuesday morning, Roy had kissed her forehead, loaded his saddlebags, and rolled out with 11 other bikers on a 400-mile charity run for a children's hospital 2 states over. 10 days on the road. He'd done it a dozen times. But on the 3rd night, in a motel parking lot outside Knoxville, something crawled up the back of Roy's neck and wouldn't leave. He couldn't name it. That's the truth. He'd called home twice and gotten no answer, which wasn't strange on its own. Ruth hated the telephone, but the feeling sat in his gut like a swallowed stone. He lay on that hard motel mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about her face when he'd left. She'd smiled, but her eyes hadn't. There'd been something in them he hadn't stopped to read, because he'd been in a hurry, because he always figured there'd be time. At 4 in the morning, he sat up in the dark and said, out loud to nobody, "I'm going home." His road captain, a bull of a man named Tank, argued with him over gas station coffee at dawn. "Preach. You'll break the man's heart. Dobbins is counting on that check being handed over by the whole crew." "Then you hand it over," Roy said. "Something's wrong at my house." "I feel it." Tank looked at him a long moment. He'd known Roy 30 years. He'd never once seen him leave a run early. "You feel it," Tank repeated. "In my teeth," Roy said. Tank nodded slow. That was enough. In their world, when a man said he felt it in his teeth, you didn't ask twice. "Ride safe, brother. Call when you get there." Roy rode 200 miles that day with the throttle wide open and the stone in his gut growing heavier by the hour. He didn't stop for lunch. He barely stopped for gas. By the time he crossed into Cedar Hollow County, the sun was gone and the hills had turned the color of an old bruise. The nearer he got, the harder his heart pounded, and he was a man who'd faced down knives without blinking. He came up the ridge road at 9 at night, and the first thing he saw was the house, dark, every window black. Now understand, in 34 years, Ruth had never once let that house go dark before he came home. There was always a light in the kitchen, always. It was her way of saying, "I'm here, come find me." That little yellow square in the window had guided him up that ridge through rain, through snow, through the worst nights of his life. Tonight there was nothing, and Diesel was already at the gate screaming. Roy killed the engine and the silence rushed in around him, and that's where our story really begins. He hit the gate and the old bloodhound went out of his mind. Diesel was 12 years old, half-deaf, slow on the hips, a dog who mostly slept in the sun these days. But now he was throwing himself at the bars, howling. And the second Roy got the gate open, the dog seized his jacket sleeve in his teeth and pulled. "Diesel, Diesel, easy." Roy tried to break for the house, for the front door, but the dog wouldn't let him. Every time Roy turned toward the porch, Diesel cut him off, barking, hauling him sideways across the yard toward the dark shape of the barn out back. Roy's whole body went cold. He pulled free of the dog and ran for the house instead. The front door was unlocked. He shoved through it. "Ruth, Ruthie." His voice bounced off the walls and came back empty. He slapped the light switch. The kitchen bloomed yellow and he stood there, chest heaving, looking at a room that was too clean, too still. No supper on the stove. No radio playing her gospel station low the way she liked. Her reading glasses sat folded on the table next to a coffee cup gone cold and skinned over. She wasn't there. He tore through the house room by room, calling her name, and every room was empty and every room was wrong. And then he came to his own back closet and his blood turned to ice water. The false wall was open. Roy dropped to his knees and pulled the steel box out into the light and threw back the lid. Empty. $41,000. 30 years of a brotherhood's blood and sweat. Gone. Nothing left in the box but a single folded sheet of paper and a school composition notebook, black and white marbled cover, the kind a kid buys for $1. His hands shook so hard he could barely open the notebook. And inside, in Ruth's small, careful handwriting, were names. Names and numbers, page after page after page. The Hutchins family, 400 Nav. Roof. Delia Ward, 220 heat, 2 months. The Prout boys, 600 Daddy's funeral. Sal at the hardware, 1,100 to keep the doors open. Mrs. Ambrose, 90 a week groceries, don't let her know it's charity, leave it in the mailbox. On and on, dozens of names. Nearly every family in Cedar Hollow was in that book, and Roy knew every one of them. He knew them because every single one of those people had looked at him like dirt for 22 years. The Hutchins woman who crossed the street when she saw him coming. Sal at the hardware store who'd once told him to shop somewhere they didn't mind the element. Mrs. Ambrose, who'd written a letter to the county trying to get the club's Sunday rides banned as a public nuisance. Ruth had given them everything, every dollar of the war chest, to the very people who despised her husband. Roy sat down on the closet floor with the notebook in his lap, and for a long moment he genuinely could not think. Rage and confusion and a strange, splitting heartbreak all crashed through him at once. She'd emptied the sacred fund, behind his back, for years by the look of these dates. She'd fed his enemies with his brother's money and never said one word. He picked up the folded sheet of paper. It was a note, and it was in her hand, and it was dated 8 months back. Roy, my love. If you ever find this before I get the courage to tell you, then I'm sorry and I'm not sorry both at once. There are people in this town going hungry and I could not sit in a warm house and let it happen. I know what that money means to you. I know I had no right. But I looked at those children and I heard the sermon you never preach with your mouth. You always said the club protects people who can't protect themselves. Well, so do I yours until it's done, Ruth. Roy read it 3 times. And slowly the rage drained out of him and left something worse behind. Fear. Because the note explained the money. It didn't explain the dark house. It didn't explain the cold coffee, or the glasses on the table, or why his wife wasn't home at 9 o'clock at night, or why his dog was still out there in the yard, howling for the barn. He made himself get up. He made himself walk back to the kitchen. He set the notebook on the table, and he pulled out Ruth's chair, and he sank down into it because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He picked up her cold cup of coffee, and for no reason he could explain, he took a sip of it. It tasted like nothing. He set it down. "All right," he said quietly to the empty room. "All right, Ruthie, there's a reason. There's always a reason with you." His voice steadied. His breathing slowed. Maybe she was at her sister's. Maybe her sister took sick. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he'd ridden 200 miles scared over a woman who was just visiting family and forgot to leave the light on the one time in 34 years. Diesel finally came in through the open door. The old dog crossed the kitchen and lay down against Roy's boots with a long, tired groan, like he'd given up. His flank rose and fell. The house was quiet. Roy reached down and put his hand on the dog's warm head, and for 1 full minute, he let himself believe the worst was over. That's when the light hit the window. It swept across the kitchen wall, bright white, moving, then another, headlights. A whole river of them pouring up the ridge road toward his house. Diesel was on his feet in a heartbeat, barking at the door. Roy stood so fast he knocked the chair over. He went to the window and his stomach dropped through the floor. There had to be 20 vehicles coming up that road. 30. Pickup trucks and station wagons and rusted-out sedans. A line of them stretching back down the ridge as far as he could see, and they were all turning in at his gate. And here's what went through Roy Calhoun's head in that second. They know. Somehow the whole town knows the money's gone, or the club found out first and sent word, or these people came up here angry about something Ruth did, and now they were arriving in the dark in a mob at a house with no one in it but him and an old dog. He'd faced down worse than a mob, but he'd never faced one wondering where his wife was. Roy walked out onto the porch. He didn't grab a weapon. That wasn't the man he was. He just stood there, 6'3" of gray beard and worn leather, and he watched the trucks fill his yard until there was no room left, engines cutting off one by one, doors opening and people climbing out. Old people, young people, whole families. They came through his gate and stopped on his lawn and looked up at him standing on that porch. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. Then a man stepped forward out of the crowd, holding his hat in his hands. It was Sal from the hardware store, the same Sal who'd told Roy to shop elsewhere. Now he stood at the bottom of Roy's steps with his eyes wet and his voice breaking. "Mr. Calhoun," Sal said, "we heard you come home early. Ronnie down at the diner saw your bike come through and called around." We didn't want you finding out alone." "Finding out what?" Roy said. His voice came out low and dangerous, and half of it was fear. "Where's my wife, Sal? Where's Ruth?" The whole crowd seemed to flinch at once. An old woman pushed to the front. Mrs. Ambrose, the one who'd tried to ban his rides. She was crying openly now, this proud woman, and she climbed the first step toward him with her hands out. "3 days ago," she said. "3 days ago your Ruth was carrying groceries out to my car in the lot behind the church, and she went down, Mr. Calhoun, her heart. She went down right there on the pavement." The porch tilted under Roy's boots. He grabbed the post. "She's alive," Mrs. Ambrose said quickly, gripping his arm. "She's alive, do you hear me?" The Prout boy did the chest compressions till the ambulance came. Delia Ward rode with her to the county hospital and never left her side. She had a bad valve, they said. She'd known for a year and told nobody. They operated. She pulled through it, Mr. Calhoun. She's a fighter, that woman." Roy's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "We tried to reach you," Sal said. "Nobody had a number that worked. Ruth wouldn't let us try harder. Even from her hospital bed she said, 'Don't you ruin Roy's charity run. Those children need him more than I do.' That's your wife. That's who she is. And now here's where I have to stop and say something to you directly. Because if you've made it this far, you already feel it in your chest, same as Roy did. If this story is getting to you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what happens in the next few minutes is the reason I sat down to tell it in the first place. All right, stay with me, because Roy still didn't understand why they were all here, on his lawn, in the dark, 20, 30 families standing in his yard with their heads bowed. If Ruth was alive, if she'd pulled through, then this wasn't a vigil. So what was it? Diesel answered before anyone else could. The old bloodhound shoved past Roy's legs, thundered down the porch steps, and ran straight for the barn, howling that same broken howl. Then he stopped at the barn doors, and he turned, and he looked back at his master, and he barked once. Loud, clear, "Come." Sal wiped his face with the back of his hand. "She made us promise," he said. "Ruth made us promise if you ever came home before she could tell you herself, we'd show you the barn. She said, 'Don't let him think ill of me till he's seen the barn.'" Roy came down off that porch slow. The crowd parted for him, this sea of people who'd never once made room for him in their lives, and now they stepped back and let him through, and some of them reached out and touched his arm as he passed, just barely, like you'd touch something holy. He walked to the barn with his old dog leading, and the whole town of Cedar Hollow following behind him in the dark, their feet whispering through the wet grass. He reached the barn doors. His hands were shaking again, worse than at the gate. Gripped the handle, and he pulled. Somebody inside had already lit the lamps. For a second, Roy's eyes couldn't make sense of it. His barn, his cluttered, broken-down barn full of engine parts and old hay, was gone. In its place was something else entirely: shelves. Row after row of clean wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, running the whole length of the building. And every shelf was stocked. Canned goods, bags of flour and rice and beans in neat towers, diapers, baby formula, boxes of medicine. Winter coats sorted by size and hung on a rack. Bundles of firewood stacked against the far wall. Along one whole side ran a long table with a hand-painted sign nailed above it, and the sign said, in Ruth's careful letters, "The Lord sets a table. Take what you need. Leave what you can." This was where the money had gone. Not into a hole, into this. A pantry, a lifeline. His wife had turned their barn into the thing that had kept half of Cedar Hollow alive through the winter. The shirt factory closed, and 300 people lost their jobs in a single week. And on the back wall, where Roy hung his tools, there were no tools anymore. There were letters, hundreds of them. Pinned up in rows, some in crayon, some in the shaky hand of the very old, and Roy walked down the length of that wall reading them and could not stop the tears now, could not have stopped them for anything in the world. "Thank you for the coats. My kids were warm at Christmas. Miss Ruth, the medicine kept my mother alive. God bless you. I don't know who you are, but there was food in my mailbox every Friday for 6 months. Whoever you are, thank you. You saved us." That last one wasn't signed. Roy knew, standing there, that Ruth had made sure of it. She'd left food in mailboxes for people too proud to take charity, and she'd made certain they never knew who to thank, so they'd never have to feel small. That was his wife. That was the quiet woman who apologized to furniture. He turned around to the crowd gathered in the barn doorway. His voice, when it came, was wrecked. "She never told me. 22 years, you people looked at me like I was garbage. And she was feeding your children the whole time." Sal stepped forward, and now the man was sobbing outright. "We know. God forgive us, Mr. Calhoun, we know. We treated you like the devil for the leather on your back. And your wife was the closest thing to an angel this town ever had, and we didn't even know it was her, half of us, till she went down in that parking lot and the truth came out." He gestured behind him at all of them. "You want to know why we're here? We're not here for a funeral. We're here to give it back." And that's when Roy saw it. Every single person in that crowd was holding something: an envelope, a jar of coins, a folded check. The Prout boys, whose daddy's funeral Ruth had paid for, were holding a coffee can heavy with cash. Delia Ward held out an envelope with $220 in it, the exact amount to the dollar that was written next to her name in Ruth's notebook. Mrs. Ambrose held a check that shook in her old hand. "We took up a collection," Sal said. "The whole town, everybody she ever helped and everybody who wished they'd helped her sooner. We know about your club's fund. Ruth told us from her hospital bed, crying, saying she stole from the men you love and she couldn't die with it on her conscience." He swallowed. "So we're putting it back, all of it, and then some. There's more than $41,000 in these hands, Mr. Calhoun. There's near 70. Roy stood in the middle of his transformed barn and looked at $70,000 held out to him in coffee cans and crumpled envelopes by the hands of people he'd spent 2 decades believing hated him. And he understood, finally, all at once, everything his wife had known for years and never needed to say. That you don't win a town over with your fists or your motorcycle or even your good deeds shouted from a rooftop. You win it quietly, in mailboxes, in the dark, one family at a time, asking nothing back. But even then, even standing in the middle of all of it, Roy's heart was only half in that barn, because the woman who built it wasn't there. And Diesel was still whining. The old dog hadn't stopped. He was pulling at Roy's sleeve again, tugging him toward the far corner of the barn, past the shelves, to a door that led to the old tack room. Roy followed his dog. He opened the tack room door, and there, in a wheelchair somebody had borrowed from the county hospital, wrapped in one of her own quilts, pale and thin and 3 days out of open-heart surgery, sat Ruth Calhoun. She'd made them bring her home. Roy found out later she'd signed herself out against every doctor's order. The second Ronnie at the diner phoned the hospital to say Roy's Harley had come through town. She would not, she told the nurses, have her husband walk into that barn and hear it from strangers. She'd had Delia drive her up the ridge and park her in the tack room, and she'd been sitting there in the dark, alone, listening to the trucks arrive, waiting for the sound of her man's boots. "Hey, preacher," she whispered. She smiled, and this time her eyes smiled too. Roy crossed that room and fell on his knees in front of her wheelchair and put his gray head in her lap. And this enormous man, this president of 31 years, wept like a boy, while his wife stroked his hair with a hand still bruised from the IV needles. "I'm sorry I took the money," she murmured. "I'm not sorry what I did with it." "Don't you dare be sorry," he choked. "Don't you ever be sorry. Ruthie, I rode 200 miles because I felt it in my teeth. I felt you go down, I felt it." He lifted his wet face to look at her. "Why didn't you tell me about your heart? About any of it?" "Because you'd have made me stop riding out to the mailboxes," she said simply. "And there were people who needed the mailboxes more than I needed to be careful." He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. Outside the tack room, the whole town of Cedar Hollow had gone quiet, gathered among the shelves Ruth had built, waiting. And Roy stood up and he wiped his face with his sleeve, and he wheeled his wife out into the light of the barn where all of them could see her. The sound they made when she appeared wasn't a cheer. It was softer than that and bigger. It was the sound of a whole town's grief and gratitude coming loose at once, people crying and laughing and reaching for her, and Ruth lifting one thin hand to wave at all of them like she'd waved at neighbors for 22 years who never waved back. Only now they waved back, every one of them. Roy held up his hand and the barn went still, because when Preacher raised his hand, people had always gone quiet, even people who feared him. Now they went quiet out of love. "I've stood in this town 22 years, Roy said, his voice rough as gravel, "and I always thought you all looked past me because you couldn't see me. Turns out I was the one who couldn't see. My wife saw every last one of you. She saw you hungry and cold and too proud to ask, and she fed you anyway, and she never once let you know it cost her a thing." He put his hand on Ruth's shoulder. "So here's how this is going to work. This money you brought, it's going right back in that box on that shelf, every dollar. And we're not shutting this barn down. We're growing it. The Iron Disciples are going to build Ruth Calhoun the finest food pantry these hills have ever seen. And it's going to have her name over the door. And it's going to stay open long after all of us are gone." And they did. That's not the kind of promise Roy Calhoun broke. By the next spring, the barn had a proper foundation and a real roof and a walk-in cooler the club paid for. The men who'd mocked his leather now stood beside those bikers on Saturdays, unloading trucks together, and somewhere in the sweat of that shared work the old fear just quietly died. Mrs. Ambrose, who'd once tried to ban the Sunday rides, became the pantry's head volunteer, and she was known to swat any biker who tracked mud on her clean floor. Sal donated the shelving from his hardware store, all of it, at cost of nothing. The Prout boys grew up and patched in with the Disciples, and to this day they'll tell you it's because a biker's wife buried their father when they had nothing. Ruth's heart never was strong again. She took it slower after that, the way she should have all along. But she lived, and she lived a good long while, and every Friday for the rest of her life there was food left quietly in the mailboxes of people too proud to ask. And to this day, some of those old folks in Cedar Hollow will swear they never knew who to thank. Roy knew. Roy always knew. He hung her note on the back wall of that barn, framed, right in the middle of all the crayon letters. "Yours until it's done, Ruth." And underneath it he hung the marbled composition notebook, open to the first page, so anyone who came in hungry could see they were far from the first, and far from alone. As for old Diesel, he lived 2 more years, and he spent them lying in a patch of sun by the pantry door, watching folks come and go. The town fed that dog so many scraps he got round as a barrel. When he finally passed, the whole of Cedar Hollow turned out to bury him behind the barn, and Roy stood over the grave of the bloodhound who'd met him at that gate in the dark and refused to let him walk into the house alone. "You knew, old man," Roy said, resting a hand on the fresh dirt. "You knew before any of us, you just couldn't say it." People still talk about the night the biker came home early. How the whole town tracked his return through the diner grapevine and poured up that ridge in the dark, scaring the man half to death. How they came not with torches but with envelopes. How a quiet woman in a wheelchair, 3 days out of surgery, had turned the meanest-looking house on the hill into the beating heart of the county. But if you ask Roy Calhoun, sitting on his porch these days with his gray beard longer than ever, he'll tell you the story a little different. He'll tell you it started with a dog at a gate, dragging a scared old man toward a barn in the dark. And he'll tell you the lesson took him 62 years and 34 of marriage to finally learn. That the loudest man in the room is almost never the strongest one. That the strongest one is usually the quietest woman you never bothered to notice. And that sometimes home isn't waiting behind the front door where you expect it. Sometimes it's out back in a barn, built one quiet act of love at a time by the person who loved you enough to keep a secret this beautiful, right up until the night the whole town came to give it back.